You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. We could tell this next story with numbers. There's a lot of data. But at its core, this is a story about Native American kids and how year after year, law enforcement and lawmakers in Olympia allow these children to be arrested and jailed at far higher rates than their white peers. Those experiences as children have lasting consequences well into adulthood. State officials and lawmakers know there's a problem, but advocates say they still haven't done enough to stop it. Melanie Henshaw covers Indigenous affairs for InvestigateWest, and she has a series of reported articles out now on InvestigateWest's website talking about this issue. Melanie, thank you so much for being here.
Libby, thank you so much for having me.
So I want to kind of dive into this with you. You have been going through the data going back 3 decades on this issue. Can you talk to me about how Native American children are getting arrested and jailed in Washington state and how that compares to their white peers?
Absolutely. So over time, the state itself has collected data and repeatedly drawn the same conclusion that youth of color, Native American kids included, are overrepresented at every stage in the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system. And that starts out with really high rates of arrest. So essentially, Native kids are dramatically overrepresented in arrest rates, essentially meaning that they are arrested more for both violent crimes, but also really vastly overrepresented in nonviolent property crime arrests, where they're like 7 times more likely to be arrested for nonviolent property crimes than white children. And that doesn't mean that Native kids are committing an overall greater number of crimes than white children. It means that based on their population share, they're far more likely to be arrested for these crimes. Because I've seen some folks say, well, if they're committing more crimes, shouldn't they be arrested more? And really, it's about how many Native kids are in the population and how likely they are to be arrested for certain offenses when you compare them to their white peers.
And also when they're in the system, how they're treated. Like, this really stuck out to me. This is according to 2023 data from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Indigenous juveniles in Washington, this is your reporting here, are nearly 30 times more likely to be sent back to detention over an administrative probation violation. So what does that mean, Melanie? This is like when they're supposed to talk to their probation officer and they miss that connection. They're 30 times more likely to be sent back to juvenile detention than white kids. I mean, tell me more about that.
Right. So these are kids who have already gone through the system and been put on probation, meaning that they face jail time if they don't comply with the conditions of their probation, which often include things like checking in with a probation officer at scheduled times, abiding by a curfew, or even wearing an electric ankle monitor. And essentially, these things in themselves aren't crimes, they're probation violations. But when they happen, you are called in front of a judge. Your probation officer is there, and they have the ability to decide to send you back to jail or to grant you some leniency, to submit some other condition of your probation, perhaps, that allows you to stay out. But the numbers really show that when kids are in these situations, white children are just granted far more leniency than Native kids and youth of color at large. One of the folks I spoke with was a public defender in Clallam County who has a lot of clients who are Native American and says that in her experience that they don't receive the same leniency when they go in front of a judge and plead their case for being kept out of juvenile facilities, juvenile jail. And often these kids are going at it alone. They don't have the support of a family or guardian. And it's shown through the numbers that they don't have the same chances to avoid jail.
Yeah, this discretion element is really a big deal. It appears through your reporting. You have this anecdote in the piece about a probation violation in Clallam County where a Native kid is sent back to detention. This is according to a public defender that you spoke to. And it was the type of thing where the public defender was trying to argue for an extra week to kind of show that the kid was getting back on track. The kid had written a letter, and this public defender felt really strongly about what happened. Can you tell me a little bit about what they told you?
Sure. The public defender told me that the probation officer refused to read this 3-page handwritten letter that the child had written pleading their case. Some things that were going on in that child's life was that one of their older siblings was also incarcerated and they were facing a lot of tumult at home. Essentially, the court declined to read the letter and consider the letter and ultimately sent the child back to jail for another 30 days. And I actually spoke with the public defender again later on and learned that when the child re-entered, according to this public defender, they didn't receive a lot of support upon reentry, which is one of the most difficult times for children, which is when they are coming out of jail and needing to reintegrate themselves into their family, into their community, and work to get away from these behaviors that have led them to interact with the law enforcement. And after being released from this 30-day detention, the child ended up committing allegedly additional felonies, which will now potentially subject them to more jail time. So just this repeated cycle that I saw a lot through my reporting where kids commit a crime, they are incarcerated, come out, don't receive support upon reentry, and end up committing more offenses and going deeper and deeper into the system.
You make a note that there is a difference between counties here, and there's an urban and rural divide in terms of this huge disparity in the way that Native kids are treated by the criminal legal system. Whitman and Okanagan counties really seem to be exceptionally seeing this disparity even more than other places, and it's kind of skewing some of the statewide numbers. What is going on in Whitman and Okanagan?
Across the state, some of the biggest disparities I saw were in rural counties. In places like Whitman, the arrest rate for Native juveniles was around 7 times higher. And in Okanagan County, these disparities extend beyond the juvenile legal system. Essentially, not only do Native kids make up more than half of all juvenile arrests in Okanagan County, even though the overall Native population is less than 10%, they are also the most likely to be referred to court for truancy. So you have multiple points of entry into the system there, as well as ongoing issues with law enforcement towards the community at large. For context, Okanagan County is directly abutting the Confederated Tribes of Colville Reservation. You also have some reporting I did earlier this year in that area reflecting discretionary searches by police, meaning when the law doesn't require the police to make a search, but they choose to do so anyway. And Native people are really overrepresented in that area. There's some traffic cameras pointed at critical arteries on the reservation, or on and off the reservation as well, which sort of just contributes to this overall feeling that some folks in that area have told me that they have, which is that they're being unfairly targeted by state law enforcement.
So you talk about some solutions that have been on the table. There have been efforts to address this in the past. What do advocates think need to happen, and what are lawmakers talking about? Are they responsive to that? What's going on?
So I have heard from some lawmakers since my series has been published who feel that this represents an injustice in the system that needs to be rectified. One of the issues that has had some more targeted efforts in the legislature is around the issue of children being charged as adults, which is an issue that I just published an article on this week that looks at the fact that even though legislation that sought to limit the number of kids who are charged as adults has successfully limited the overall number of children who are being charged as adults, what it's left in its wake is huge disparities where you have more than 80% of children who are charged as adults are not white. And so lawmakers I've spoken with have also felt like there isn't necessarily the political will or support to provide these sort of wraparound support and care that people need. Advocates I've spoken with have been a little bit more critical and say that this is an element or a manifestation of structural racism in the system. And it shows that the system isn't built to rehabilitate and support Native children and youth of color more broadly.
What do we know? This seems like a very basic and straightforward thing to ask you, Melanie, but what do we know about what happens when you're offered services or diversion versus time in detention, time behind bars? Like, what does it mean for a person's life as they age, a child into adulthood?
Right. So research does show that children who are offered a pathway away from jail through therapy, anger management, or some other form of serving their sentence in the community rather than behind bars are less likely to reoffend down the line. And if you continue to incarcerate children, it shows that they are more likely to reoffend, particularly for this issue of kids who are charged as adults. These are really serious crimes. And by subjecting them to the adult court, data shows that they're actually more likely to just continue to reoffend. It's difficult to say that there's any efforts in the legislature to limit these issues of long and lifelong sentences because a lot of these people are charged with really violent crimes.
This has been going on for decades, this disparity. And as you say, in some ways, it's gotten worse, even with recent criminal justice changes and reforms. We had a ton of conversations starting in 2020 about unequal treatment and inequities in the criminal legal system. If we all can look at this data, again, I cannot get over that Native kids in Washington are 30 times more likely than white kids to get sent back to detention for a probation violation. So, kids who are in the system and the white kids tend to be getting, a second chance to stay out of detention. Again, to like the many, many, many multiples of times compared with the Native kids. So if everybody can look at that and say that that is inequity, why has this not been addressed?
The conversation around juvenile justice, juvenile legal reforms has really shifted several times over the past few years. When COVID first happened, you had a large drop in the overall number of people who were being incarcerated, and that has ticked back up in the past couple years. You have actually fewer kids who are being charged with misdemeanors and more kids who are being charged with severe felonies. Part of that is because kids who are being charged with less severe crimes are being diverted out of the system. But all that to say is that based on conversations I've had with people who work really closely with tribal communities and tribal governments, that these are getting around the issue, but not targeted efforts to address disparities for Native kids. And issues where Native people are really disproportionately impacted in the broader system, like including the adult system. For example, the issue of a practice called the juvenile point system, where adults who were already sentenced as kids for a separate felony automatically have their sentences lengthened as an adult.
Those points count against them, even though the violation occurred when they were kids.
Yep. And more than 40% of incarcerated Native people have their sentence extended through juvenile points. And the practice was ended for future use in 2023, but multiple efforts by Representative Chris Stearns, who's a citizen of the Navajo Nation as well, have failed to advance because people are concerned about the impact on victims. And there's pushback from law enforcement about letting people be resentenced when they have been charged with serious violent crimes. So the more targeted efforts to address issues that disproportionately impact Native people just have languished, despite the efforts of advocates and other Indigenous people who are in the legislature.
Did you hear from prosecutors or judges or anybody who has discretion over these things about why these issues persist? I mean, is there anybody who justifies why these numbers are so skewed?
I don't know that they would say that they are justified, but they do push back on the notion that there's willful racism on the part of prosecutors. And folks I've spoken with who work on the prosecutor side, multiple have told me, we've never said we want to treat this person more harshly because of their race or their ethnicity. But they've admitted that there is unconscious bias in the system that many people do have. Research from places like the Harvard School of Public Health show that people view Black children and other children of color as more mature and adult-like than white kids. Sometimes when you're looking at kids as young as 5 years old, that perception of adultification starts to crop up. And so that also plays into charging decisions and sentencing decisions, where ultimately kids are being subjected to more harsh sentences because of perceptions of the source of their delinquency, whether it was a mistake or they're perceived to have made, an error, versus these other issues where youth of color are seen to be inherently violent or to be repeat offenders and therefore charged with more harsh offenses and subjected to harsher penalties.
It's the difference between boys will be boys or throw the book at this kid. Like, that's sometimes where it comes down to. Melanie Henshaw, really appreciate your reporting always on these issues. Melanie covers Indigenous affairs for InvestigateWest. Thank you very much. And folks should definitely check out the whole series. You're still coming out with new stories on this. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Libby. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.